Well, good morning, everybody. I'm excited to get started on this series because it's just so fun, and political topics are always a lot of fun around the dinner table. And we've got the holidays coming up, so we might as well do it. And, I was thinking, I don't know who you first remember being president, but I was born in 71, so the first president that I remember being in office is Jimmy Carter. And because I was I guess 9 when he lost the election, he was the only president I ever remembered and at the time. And I thought he would always be the president. I'd never seen anybody lose publicly like that. And I remember crying because I thought, man, I thought he was going to be the guy, right? My parents didn't share my sadness, but I just remember thinking that was a thing. So here's what I thought was, who do you remember, who's the first president you remember being in office? Why don't you just take 10 seconds and ask the person beside you, who's the first president you remember being in office? Okay, and then ask them. Yeah, it should be like one word or two. All right? All right, let's do this. I will first of all say, was that you, Charlie? I just, right out of the gate when I asked, Charlie goes, Eisenhower. And I thought, that is so, it was Charlie, I think it was you, Charlie. I heard, it sounded like you said Truman. Wow. I've read about these people in the history books. They sound, that is amazing. I love that. All right, in this section over here, somebody shout out the first president you remember in office. Eisenhower. Okay, Eisenhower people, calm down. Who else? Somebody remembered Carter? All right, you're a Gen Xer. There are a few of us around anymore, but we got to really support each other. Right here. I heard Nixon and LBJ. Okay. Clinton. It was kind of a deep voice that said Clinton. Who said Clinton? That would be a little younger, deep voice. All right, right here. First president you remember being in office. Okay. I didn't ask who you were voting for, but who was the first president you remember in office? I heard some Bush, which is great because you've got about 12 years to cover there. It could be anybody. That's awesome. Well, so here's what I recognize. I'm glad that we can laugh right now because as we get going into this conversation, it can be a little tense at times when you talk about things like politics. So here's what I want you to do to maybe kind of relieve the tension. What I would like you to do now is look to the person beside you and tell them who you're going to vote for in this next election. No, I'm kidding. Don't, please don't. Please don't. Yeah, calm down. All right. So I was telling my brother-in-law who lives out of town, I was telling him that he asked, what are you going to be preaching about today? I said, well, I'm actually going to preach about how to disagree politically but love unconditionally. He goes, oh, good. I bet those people really need that. And we both laughed because we all see political divide and problems as somebody else's causing, as somebody else's problem, right? By the way, my brother-in-law and sister-in-law, Mike and Cinnamon, are here today. Welcome them if you would. If he gets up and leaves in a minute, then you'll know he disagrees, but hey, that's all right. We'll still be family. The truth is, I'm going to talk a lot of we's today, and I want to define who I'm talking about. I am not talking about Church at the Creek, and I'm not talking about the church that I used to pastor, but what I am talking about is the capital C church, meaning evangelical Christians in our nation. And in order to set up what we're going to talk about today, as we prepare for this political season, by the way, we got a debate coming up this Tuesday night, and then we've got, a little excitement there, all right? Then we have an election on November the 5th, but before we talk about what's coming in the future, I want us to go back to the past. In fact, just 4 years back, when we were smack dab in the middle of a global pandemic and the world was shut down and we were seeing deepening political divide. Does anybody remember that? It feels like a bad fever dream, doesn't it? Like, did that actually happen? But the truth is, none of us were handed instructions on, here's how you'll handle a global pandemic, right? I know when I went to seminary, there was not a class called Pastoring in a Pandemic. If there hadn't, I wouldn't have taken it if they'd offered it, right? Who would ever need such a thing? But here's what I learned during a pandemic, and the pandemic exposed something about American evangelicals, and that is what we value the most. See, our response to the pandemic made something embarrassingly clear. Despite all the things that we talk about at church about our faith, what we value the most has nothing to do with our faith. What does American church attenders value the most? Winning. Winning politically. So for all our talk about the Great Commission and revivals and baptisms and life change and reaching the lost, the pandemic revealed that isn't our primary concern for most evangelical Christians. Instead, we found ourselves divided over vaccines, Anthony Fauci, and protests. And along the way, when whether your party won or not in the 2020 election, Christianity lost credibility, even though it was our golden moment. And we're going to talk about today's in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, and we're going to see the Apostle Paul, when he was in a politically charged environment, how he decided to live his life and model a way for us to live our life. But first, I want to be really personal and share with you what it was like for me to pastor in a pandemic. And it all began for me on Tuesday night, March the 10th of 2020. And I was in an elder meeting there in Los Gatos, California with our elders, and we were talking about something completely different when all of a sudden we got the announcement that our local school district had closed down. And the same night we got the notification that our county, Santa Clara, was closing all its public buildings and all the governmental buildings. And so we began to wrestle with, well, what will we do this Sunday? And we came to the conclusion, based on being a good neighbor, that we thought the wise decision was not to have an in-person service this Sunday for this very temporary thing. And what we'll do instead is we'll go online and do an online service. We thought that was the wise thing to do. And later in the week, a lot of churches would make similar decisions. But because we happened to be in an elder meeting at the time it all happened, we just got to go first in making that decision. Well, word got out, and Fox News, the next day, the local Fox News reporter and cameraman came and did an interview with me to talk about why we made that decision. And as word got out, believe it or not, a lot of people in our church loved it, and a lot of people in our church hated it. And people began to take me to lunch and to coffee and tell me things like, well, Mark, you just need to take a stand. And I always thought, well, I think we're taking a stand, we're just not taking the stand you want us to take. And I began to see this pattern over and over again. And I began to experience something I had never experienced before as a pastor, and that is people began to choose their church and view their church through a political lens. Not through how the teaching was, how the worship was, how the doctrine was, how the programming was, how the outreach and impact in the community was, but are they red enough or blue enough for my political preferences? And I had never seen that before. And it was just a couple of months later when on May 25th, George Floyd's horrific death was captured on video. And all of a sudden, there was this new level of social and racial unrest in our communities. And it was just about a week later, on June the 3rd, when a girl from our high school organized a Black Lives Matters protest that would march right in front of our church. Our town was affluent and seen by some to be part of the problem with inequality. So as the protest of that date was approaching and there was regional attention being given to it, and there was a growing anxiety in our little community in the days leading up to this scheduled march. And a few days before the march, the chief of police reached out to me and he said, Mark, I've got two questions I just want to ask you. Number one, would you be willing to allow your church facility to be our mobile command center for our police department on the moment or the day of the march? And I said, absolutely. And so they had full access to our entire facilities. He goes, I have a second question to ask you. I want to see, would you then also be willing to march in the protest march? And I said, well, what would I do? And he said, I just want you to be a person of peace as people are walking to keep the temperature low. And I thought, well, that sounds like something Jesus would do. And so I called up a bunch of other pastors and I invited them to come with me. Me and my family, we ended up walking on this march. And you can't see it, but on one of the pictures, the church building was right there, and as we walked by it. And then about 2,000 of us ended up at a park circled up, and this is where things got interesting. As we circled up in this big crowd, everyone looked at this high school girl, and she felt so overwhelmed, like anybody would, when so many people were looking at her expecting there to be speeches, which they actually had planned, but she just wasn't sure, how do I get this thing started? How do I welcome everybody and kind of get it off the ground? And she's got her bullhorn there, and she looks over at me and she goes, I know that you're a pastor. Would you get us started here today? I'm a white guy from West Texas, And so I just stepped up and I introduced myself and the church that I pastored down the road. And I remember saying, hey, look, we all want to see a better way forward, but we're a community of faith and we'd like to take this journey with you and in a united way. And they were very receptive. But I'm going to be honest with you, I felt so over my head. And at that moment, the local media was there. And as you can imagine, the word got out. And when the word got out, there were some people in our church who loved that so much. And there were some people in our church who hated that so much. And I began to be taken to coffee and lunches again, told, you just need to take a stand. And I remember thinking, I think we're taking a stand. We're just not taking your stand. And that happened over and over and over with every political issue, with the next stage in the pandemic and whatever decision the church had to make. But I knew the coffees and lunches would start again for me to take a stand. Got a lot of free food and coffee. Well, March the 1st of 21, we moved, and I began my role here. And we loved our time in California, but when we moved back home to Texas, like all churches, our church here was still requiring masks and social distancing. And it was the very next day, on March the 2nd, when Governor Abbott no longer required masks in the public buildings and in schools. So then it was the very next day, on March the 3rd, which would be my very first staff meeting. Guess what we're discussing? Do we require masks when we have services this Sunday? And believe it or not, it became a very contentious conversation as people were on different sides of the issue. We came to a decision to follow the state leaders' guidance, and guess what? Some people loved the decision and some people hated it. I got told we need to take a stand. And as a result, some people left the church. See, during the pandemic, here's what I experienced. That people would leave the church I pastored because we weren't Republican enough and because we weren't Democratic enough. And can I be really honest with you? I was so scared. Because like you, I'd never been through that before. And I'd never seen Christians just forced on two opposing teams so quickly. And as our nation became more divided, what broke my heart was that Christians behaved the same way. And as our nation was canceling everything, Christians were canceling church. And here's what I discovered. Many evangelical Christians value winning at any cost. Cost of their character, cost of their church family, cost of their influence. They'll take anything and give it away if it allows them to win. In other words, it has nothing to do with our faith. We use that as a tool to get to the victory. And so let me just ask you a very personal question. What does it look like for a Jesus follower to win, to have victory? And I think we've got to have context because it's bigger context than just 4 years ago. But let's look back 2 millennia ago when our entire faith began, when Jesus Christ came to this earth, and there began to be some people who followed him. Did you know in the first century the term Christian, it wasn't religious, it was actually political? And what it meant was there were people who would follow Herod, and they would be called Herodians, in kind of a slang or insulting term, because they didn't follow Caesar as the Roman Empire would have preferred. And then there were people who later would follow Nero, and they would be called Neronians, in a slur or insulting way because they didn't follow Caesar in the way Roman Empire preferred. And then there was this ragtag group of people who were following this Christ. And they called them Christians in an insulting, demeaning way because they didn't follow Caesar in the way the Roman Empire preferred. In other words, in the first century, people were allowed to have as many gods as they wanted, but they had to have one king, Caesar. There's something about these first century people, they were called Christians, but it wasn't because of what they believed, but because of who they obeyed or who they followed. And unfortunately, in the pandemic, something changed in Christianity for many evangelical Christians. The first century, if we compare the first century versus the 21st century, first century people were labeled Christians in an insulting, demeaning way, not because of what they believed, but because they were so doggone set on following this Christ and the people of the way, following the life and love of Jesus. In the 21st century, in comparison, people are labeled Christian not because of who they obey and who they follow, but simply because of what they believe on certain issues. Now, I don't know about you, but I grew up in the 80s, and there was this thing called the moral majority where Christians realized, oh, there are quite a few of us, and if we organize ourselves, we actually have more political power. We can really influence the process in a more effective way. And we became a very powerful voting bloc, so powerful today that no major political candidate really does much without at least considering what it would take to win over this Christian evangelical voting bloc. The problem is, our hope was that more power would cause our faith to flourish. But let's compare. In the first century, Christianity had the lowest amount of power and political influence of all time. And our faith flourished like never before. Now we have the greatest in America political power as a Christian voting bloc. And our faith is diminishing in our nation like never before. The power is not doing to our faith what we want it to do to our faith. In fact, we've become so political. Here's the result. Today, Christians feel more comfortable with people who share their political views than with people who share their Christian faith. In other words, if you're a Republican, you might talk to another Republican, whether they're Christian or not, and feel more comfortable than talking to a Christian Democrat. We find views politically that connect us more than our views in our faith. The late pastor Tim Keller says it this way: when the church as a whole is no longer seen as speaking to questions that transcend politics, and when it is no longer united by a common faith that transcends politics, then the world sees strong evidence that Nietzsche, Freud, and Marx were right, and that religion is really just a cover for people wanting to get their way in the world. I'm afraid to say that the church, capital C, is made up of people who prioritize winning, and their theme is take a stand, but make sure it's my stand. And I just want to say, if you're new here, or you're new to faith, new to church, one of the reasons you might not have chosen to get engaged in church and Christianity is because you might have experienced Christians who prioritize their politics over you personally. And we talked about this about 3 or 4 weeks ago, that we saw Jesus come and introduce people over the law. And that includes people over politics. And that's been one of the shifts that we've seen happen the other way. What should a Jesus follower try to win primarily? Well, we're going to look at 1 Corinthians chapter 9, and I love what the Apostle Paul has to teach. If you're familiar with the Apostle Paul, then you know he's a great example. If you're not, then you should know that he was originally referred to as Saul of Tarsus, and he was this Pharisee, this very religious zealot who would go around the Mediterranean, and he was actually persecuting, particularly in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria. And he would actually have Christians, people who would follow the way, and he would have them arrested because they weren't following the true faith of Judaism. Remember, he's also a Roman citizen, so he's able to draw from all the power of the Roman Empire as well as Judaism. And he's having Christians arrested, many killed, because he's demanding that they follow the right way. He's using all the political power he can gain to get what he believes is right. He is all about winning at all cost. But something changed in the life and heart of this man. So much so, his name was actually changed from Saul to Paul. But he was on a trip to go and arrest more Christians when he had an encounter personally with Jesus Christ himself that forever changed his life. And he began to value people over power and people over politics, people over everything. And we're going to look at one of his famous things that he wrote by the power of the Holy Spirit, I believe, in telling us how we should behave in a politically charged environment that Paul found himself and that once again in this political season we find ourselves. I want you to see it in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 19. A man who had wealth, who had power, who had influence. A man who had success, and he was feared by many. He gave it all up. And now watch what he says, because he met Jesus, and it changed everything. He says in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, though I am free and belong to no one, Paul says, I have made myself a slave to everyone. Now, why would Paul give up freedom? Doesn't that actually feel like losing and not winning, to give up some of your freedom? But watch why Paul says this in the rest of verse 19. He says, I have made myself a slave to everyone in order to, say these last few words with me, to win as many people as possible. I added the word people there. To win as many as possible. In other words, he said, I'm going to give up some of my freedom because I believe what I found in Jesus will change everyone else's life. And if me giving up freedom means that they find the freedom in eternity with Jesus, it is the price I'll pay. And he goes on to say in verse 20, to the Jews I became like a Jew. Why? To the Jews I became like a Jew in order to win them. He's wanting to win them to Jesus. In other words, Paul is saying, I know you have customs. I know you have rituals. I know you have these things that you do. And when I am around you, I am going to do those things with you in order to earn the opportunity to share Jesus with you. Then Paul goes on to say, referring to the law of Moses, he says in verse 20, to those under the law, I became like the one under the law of Moses. Remember, they have like 613 laws. He goes, I know you got all these laws. I'll become like someone under the law. Though, he says, I myself am not under the law. Why? So as to win those under the law. I not only will give up some of my preferences, I will give up some of my freedom. I will actually give up some of my own rules that I don't have to follow. I will give up some of my own freedom just to share Jesus with you. And then he goes on to say, look at verse 21. Now to those not having the law, remember these are Gentiles, people who aren't Jewish, who never follow the 613 laws. He goes, I'm going to become like you. We're probably going to have a party. We're probably going to have some fun over here. I'm going to become like you. Though, he says, I am not free from God's law, I am under Christ's law. Remember, we saw that Christ is all authority over me. Paul says, Christ still has authority over me. But when I am with you, you are under the law, I will embrace that. Why? So as to win those not having the law. Paul goes on to say, to the weak I become weak. In summary, he says in verse 22, verse 23, here's what he says. At the end of the day, before I forced people to do what I wanted them to do, or there were consequences, and now look what he says after meeting Jesus. I have become all things to all people, so that by all means possible, I might save some. I do this all, why? For the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessing. Paul realized he'd been fighting the wrong battle in the wrong kingdom. And suddenly he met and discovered a new kingdom. He was a citizen of a new kingdom who had a king, and he's following that king. Paul's point now was, I want to point everybody I can to Jesus Christ, and I will use every fiber of my being for the rest of my life for that sole purpose. And I will give up every convenience, every freedom. I will give up every preference in my life. I want to see other people come to know Jesus. So when you encountered Paul, that means that you would feel loved, you would feel seen, and you would feel heard. And his goal was to love you in such a way that when you left, you would be more likely to return and drawn into having another conversation that might lead to Jesus. And here's my question. In this political season, when people encounter you, when they leave you, are they more drawn to return to you? And the possibility of being open to a conversation about Jesus. Here's why this is so important. Because you know who's not winning in our political arguments? We're not winning the next generation. They are the casualty when the church focuses on politics. In fact, I want you to see what theologian Russell Moore says. He says, we now see young evangelicals walking away from evangelicalism, not because they don't believe what the church teaches, but because they don't believe the church itself believes what the church teaches. In other words, we claim our priority is impacting a community, serving others, and reaching the lost, but it looks to them, the next generation, like our priority is winning politically. So here's a personal question. Are you more concerned about your kids' political views or their faith? And when we look at who Paul was following Jesus. And Jesus didn't come to win with power. Jesus came to lose. He came to surrender. He came to lay down. He came to open his arms and die on the cross. In fact, Jesus didn't come to win. Jesus came to save. He didn't come to conquer and conquest. He came to seek and to save the lost. And for him, that began with an open-handed surrender to people who had no right to touch the hands of our Creator and Savior. But he did it for you and for me. And Paul says, that's what I want to do. I want to open up my hands and do this for others. So what does it look like for a Jesus follower to win? Our job is not to win power, but to win people. This is what Paul did. This is what Jesus taught. And I just want to say what you already know. Winning elections is temporary. Leading people and introducing them to Jesus Christ is eternal. And whoever we elect this November, you and I will be voting again in 4 years. Because it is a temporary process in which we participate. But you know what frees me to vote on November the 5th? And I'll certainly be participating like most of you. You know what frees me to vote whenever I'm casting a vote? Is I know that all of my hope is in Jesus. That my hope isn't in any political candidate. Though I am free to participate in the process. I just want to tell you, when President Trump was the president, my hope was in Jesus. When President Biden, he's been the president, my hopes remained in Jesus. Whoever the next president is, it will remain in Jesus. Whoever is sitting in the White House doesn't compare to who's sitting on the throne. Our kingdom with Jesus Christ, amen. Here's what we know. America's never been promised to last forever, but his kingdom lasts forever. And when I participate in his mission and his cause, then I am doing the main thing that returns eternally. And what we know is we're invited into this process, but I think sometimes we get in these little battles and we lose sight of the war. And the war is there are a lot of people who our enemy is trying to hide from the Savior of the world. And our job is to be that light and not hide the light of Jesus under a bushel of political alliance. And that's what's so tempting to do in this season of contention all around. I just want to say, if you're saying, Mark, I was hoping you were going to tell us who we should vote for. Well, if you were hoping that I was going to tell you who to vote for, come back next week. Not really. No, if you hope I'll recommend who to vote for, you've missed the point. Here's what I want to say. As you consider who you will vote for, I want to challenge you to spend even more time about how you will love the people around you in this election season. How will you represent Jesus to others who have an eternal soul? How will we represent the love of God to them? Our goal is, how can we politically disagree but love unconditionally? Our job is not to win power, but to win people. It's the cause that Jesus gave you and me if you're a Jesus follower. And if you aren't a Jesus follower, I want you to know, wherever you vote politically, Jesus invites you to him. Because he came to seek and to save the lost. Listen to this. He didn't even come to be served. He came to serve and to give his life as a ransom for you. What a loving God. And he makes all the difference in the world. Paul experienced that transformation. I've experienced it. Many of you have experienced it. If you haven't experienced that, I want to invite you to that. It is the greatest decision you will make in this political season. And if you haven't made that decision yet, after the service today, we're going to have people up here who will pray with you. We'd love, just as people are leaving, just to quietly make your way here. We would love to pray with you about that. Now, for all of us, as we close, let me ask you 2 questions. First, what power do you need to stop pursuing? Maybe it's convincing people at the family dinner table about your political side at the cost of a relationship. Hey, Thanksgiving's come up. Let's be nice to each other, right? Maybe it's not even that. Maybe it's not even political at all. Maybe for you it's acquiring things. You're trying to impress people you don't even know instead of serving others in your community. There's this drive, there's this power that we tend to pursue. Or jobs at the cost of our family, whatever that looks like for you. And then secondly, what are you laying down on behalf of someone else? Paul laid down freedoms, conveniences, and preferences. What are you and I laying down on behalf of someone else? Our job isn't to win power, but to win people. And I can't close without saying this. I'm telling you, I am so proud of our church because we're getting this, we've been getting this. This is a heartbeat of our church, is to put people over everything, people over politics. We don't want to get that, we don't want labels. You know, that's the Republican church. That's the Democratic church. We want to say, no, we want to be a church where anyone can belong. And we don't want to be the place that leads with anything other than Jesus Christ, that he's the way, the truth, and the life. And so with that said, I love that that's the heart of our church. But you might say, well, Mark, if the job is to win people, what's the best way to win people? That's the point. We're not being passive politically. We participate politically. But our job, our ultimate mission is to win people. Then how do we do that? How do we win people? If it's not winning elections, what's the best way to make disciples in our nation? Because the answer to that question is exactly what got Jesus killed, and it's what launched Christianity 2,000 years ago. Unfortunately, it's that message that got buried in the pandemic, and it's starting to get buried again in this political climate. It's time we get back to that message. What is that message? Well, here's the good news. It's super simple, and it's exactly what we're going to look at together next Sunday. As we look at part 2 of Kingdom Culture, let's be people who can disagree politically, but love unconditionally. But before we look at that message together, it begins when we get it right that our job isn't to win power, isn't to win elections, but to win people. Let's pray.